So moving on then to the next chapter in Derrida's Grammatology, I want to move on to chapter 2, which is called Linguistics and Grammatology, and specifically the linguistic system that Derrida is going to deconstruct in this chapter is that of Saussure's course in general linguistics. So he gives a brilliant example of the deconstruction process in this chapter, and it is one of the most brilliant chapters, I think, that I've encountered in Derrida so far. It's quite enjoyable. He begins with a quote from Rousseau that says, "Writing is nothing but the representation of speech. It is bizarre that one gives more care to the determining of the image than to the object." So he wants to highlight in your mind this idea in the logocentric tradition that writing is normally thought of at third remove from origin, from being, from the logos, insofar as speech is a representation of the concepts of the logos, of being, and then writing then is a representation of a representation, namely a representation of speech. So it's at third remove. And he wants to remind you of this because it's going to be central to Saussure's discussion of the relationship between speech and writing, in which writing becomes exterior, it's on the outside, it's exiled. It's in a position of exile in Saussure, whereas speech will be on the inside. Linguistics itself, Saussure is generally concerned with linguistics. By linguistics, he generally means oral language, which he conceives of as something that's stable and unchanging, except very slowly over long periods of time. And what Saussure does, or how Derrida presents him, I should say, as doing, is that he constructs in classical metaphysical tradition. The metaphysical tradition is the tradition of the construction of systems through pairs of opposites, in which one of the two is always privileged over the other. And what Saussure then does is he constructs linguistics as a system, as a kind of immunologically sealed system with its own boundary. And the boundary is constructed by the fact that the only type of writing that Saussure is interested in, and he specifically says that he's excluding all other forms of writing with the exception of phonetic writing. So phonetic or alphabetic writing is the only kind of writing that he's interested in. So that forms a kind of boundary act within his linguistic system. Writing, though, in general, and that includes phonetic writing, in general is exiled to the outside of this system. So I think it's best then if you imagine this in your mind as a kind of construction of an immunologically sealed container, almost in Sloterdijkian fashion, as sealed off by a macrosphere. And in the West, this is basically what has happened. All the great metaphysical systems have been immunological containers designed to prevent semiotic chaos from taking place. So they're always sealed. They always have an interior. And inside this interior, we have being, we have logos, and we have speech as the immediate means of accessing the logos. So for Saussure, linguistics is primarily the oral tradition of speech. Writing is something that comes later, and it's presented by Saussure as a threat. It's not only exterior, it's not only outside of the interior of linguistic systems, it's a threat. It's like an antigenic viral threat that it poses. If it gets on the inside of linguistics, if it gets into speech, then it begins to rupture and disrupt, immunologically speaking, linguistic traditions by nature of the fact that writing can deform speech. It can overcode it, it can deform it, it can warp it. And he says one of the examples, for example, by the way of which this has happened, is to just take the name Lefebvre, which is spelled Lefebvre, and which is descended from Latin faber, which means craftsman, maker. Lefebvre, and he says in the written form the B and the V are included, but the B should be silent. But because people don't make that distinction in written form, they see it and they pronounce the B, and Lefebvre then is changed and it's mispronounced as Lefebvre. And he says this is one of the deforming effects that writing has on speech. Once it gets on the inside of speech, it acts in a viral way to disrupt speech, to warp it, deform it, change it, force people to mispronounce things. And so this is the way it works. This is the way that Saussure sees writing as an immunological threat. And it can be said that Derrida himself is a kind of antigen to these ancient metaphysical systems. He sort of attacks these systems as though he were himself a kind of intellectual virus, as though he were a kind of antigen that He draws out the boundaries of these systems, and then he will proceed to efface and deface and erode the membranes so that the oppositions between the insides of these systems and everything that they exile as inferior or is not privileged to the exterior of these systems. Derrida is fond of wearing down the walls. It's always an intellectual siege army battering down the walls so that these exiles can come back into the cities that they've been exiled from. In this case, they're the exiles of concepts and ideas. But Derrida he has a lot of fun with this deconstruction. Deconstruction might be thought of as dismantling the walls of metaphysical polises, metaphysical polospheres that have been erected through the Western tradition. So we have this opposition between speech and writing. Speech is on the inside, and it's analogous to the Platonic tradition that privileges on the inside is not only being its essence. The outside is associated with appearances. The inside is associated with the intelligible realm of the signifieds, the concepts. The outside is associated with the senses, the body, the sensible, that which is fallen. And so in saying that writing poses a threat to speech, it's aligned with this traditional metaphysical structure of inside, outside, appearance being on the outside. Writing is a kind of image, as Rousseau says in this comment. Writing is associated with an image, whereas sound, speech is sound, and it is the gateway to the interior of the self. So we have this structure in Saussure that's aligned with the Platonic and metaphysical tradition. And for Saussure, writing really has fallen. It's seen almost, as Derrida says here, it's seen as something that is fallen, that's negative, and the natural state. There's also the opposition between nature and culture here for Saussure. And the relationship of the concept or the signified to speech, to the voice, is natural. Quote, natural, allegedly natural, whereas writing then becomes associated with culture, with institutions, with the artificial, the technical prosthesis, that which is alien to the natural state of things. And then this will become more clear in Rousseau's essay on the origin of language, where he sees it as a kind of writing coming in as a kind of fall of the natural state of the spoken word into the artificiality of writing. And so he sets up these oppositions, and he says part of the problem with Saussure, though, is that he opposes he opposes speech to writing, but he also says that on the one hand that speech, the oral tradition, is unaffected by writing. It's something that's pure, and that basically writing can't touch. But then he also has to maintain this other point of view, that writing is a danger to speech. So there are these internal contradictions that Derrida will be very fond of getting into these systems and exposing them and bringing them to light. And then so how he does this section had been called the outside and the inside, and of course we've seen what the difference is between them thought in an immunological sense. And in the next section, the outside is the inside, and the word is crossed out here. Derrida turns is as a being word. It's the metaphysics of presence, and in crossing it out, he transforms it into a trace, basically. The outside is the inside. So what he wants to do here is, if he can demonstrate that which has been exiled to the exterior of this metaphysical system is not really exterior and can be seen to be just as interior as it is exterior, and vice versa, then the metaphysical opposition between speech and writing will turn out to be a false one. And Saussure's opposition between linguistics in a pure sense, identifying it with the oral tradition, and writing, on the other hand, identifying it as the interloper, or the antigen, the virus, will be seen to be a false opposition, and it will collapse, and Derrida will have deconstructed it. So it'll need to be the case then that in the second part of this chapter, Derrida will need to demonstrate that the opposition between speech and writing isn't quite so opposite as it sounds. That, in other words, if he can demonstrate that speech is a kind of writing, that there is a writing aspect to speech, then the opposition collapses, and it loses meaning in terms of the way meaning is patterned and organized in the logocentric tradition. And indeed, that's exactly what he does. The first thing he points out, the first thing he begins to deconstruct, is to say that Saussure had maintained that the signifier's relationship, the signifier is the acoustic image, the sound, the sense impression of the sound that the word or the sign makes, On the one hand, that's the signifier. Its relationship to the signified, the concept that it refers to, and every sign is a unification. Every sign is a unification of a signifier and a signified, of sound and sense, and the two are together. So, but they're arbitrary. They're together according to Saussure in a totally arbitrary way. So the signifier's relationship to the signified is arbitrary. But Derrida says, well, if that's the case, then if he says that, as we started with the Rousseau quote, if the position is maintained that writing is an image or a representation of speech, if writing is an image of speech, its relationship to it can't very well be arbitrary then, can it? Any more than the grapheme, the written sign's relationship to the phoneme, the spoken sign, if it's an image of it, it can't be arbitrary. And so now we're starting to find internal contradictions as Derrida begins to deconstruct the system here. We start finding basic contradictions that set up these perturbations and wobbles within this traditional metaphysic. So that's the first point that he makes in deconstructing the system. So then he goes on to ask, and he wants to know, okay, so then how language is not merely a sort of writing, but a species of writing. If we can imagine some way in which language too is a type of writing, in which it's not the case that writing is secondary, that it comes later, but that writing in a certain sense, or at least the possibility of writing, is what made speech possible in the first place to begin with. Possible. If we can find this, then we can eliminate and deconstruct this absolute opposition between speech and writing. And indeed he does this by saying that actually there is a type of writing that he calls Arche-Writing. And Arche-Writing is basically différance. It's the same thing that we had talked about before as différance and the trace. These are the tools now that he begins to use. Arche-Writing, différance, and the trace. They're all related ideas. They have somewhat different connotations, but they're all related ideas. Arche-Writing is a type of, it's the same thing as différance, but it's the spacing. It's the spacing that makes possible the play of signification in the first place. It's the originary way in which the trace makes the play of signification possible. Différance is the production of form, Derrida says, but it's the production of semiotic form. And it's to be distinguished in this sense from the way that Deleuze uses difference in repetition, where he says that difference is the means whereby morphogenesis takes place through the process of the differentiation of form in the physical world. Différance is similar, but it has to do with the generation of the pairs of signifier opposites, nature, culture, male, female, that are produced, which is, sounds like it's an archive principle, and it is, after all, Arche-Writing. But it's not something that can be nailed down. It doesn't have a location. It's not a presence. It's not a metaphysics of presence. He's linking it, he's decoupling it from the metaphysics of presence, because it's something that's more similar to the way that Kant uses the transcendental aesthetic of space and time. Kant says in the Critique of Pure Reason, space and time are the transcendental forms of our intuition that make possible any experience that we can have. Transcendental in the sense of prior to experience, because space and time precede the possibility of any experience whatsoever, and our mind brings space and time as built-in structures to our experiences and make them possible to begin with. And so Arche-Writing and the trace and différance are transcendental, and he even uses that word in this sense, the sense that it makes the originary play of signification possible, including speech. And so speech is not possible without difference. The signs, every sign takes on its identity, according to Saussure, by differentiating itself from another sign. So difference is essential to the system, but Saussure never asks how the play of signification comes about, how it is that difference is produced, and it's produced through this transcendental process of différance. Now, Derrida says that every word comes along with it. It comes along with every signifier, every sign, let's say. Sign includes signifier and signified wedded together. Every sign brings with it a kind of cloud of traces. The trace is a kind of cloud of polysemic meanings and connotations that come along with each word and functions. The trace functions almost like the linguistic equivalent of Jung's collective unconscious. They are traces of what words used to mean. They are the ghosts of what they used to mean, and so when you perform an archaeology on words, basically etymology, you can find traces of what words used to mean. Heidegger was very fond of doing this.